Field Guide. Karrakin Trade Baronies. Negative 6,000 U to 3,200 U. Retrieved from CENTCOM/NAVCOM. Solemn Vigil. A Lancer Supplement. Version 1.8.5. Miguel Lopez. Massive Press. Narrated by Duncan Lynch. Introduction. The Karrakin Trade Barons is an oligarchic polytemporal dynastic federation with a long history of war and trade. Now the single largest supplier for Union's raw material appetite, the Baronies are known for their expertise in mining and resource extraction, terrestrial, orbital, Jovian, and otherwise. The Baronies are a rarity among galactic states. Founded pre-fall, their society and culture, much like the On, charted an unbroken history from foundation to the present day. However, where the On regard Cradle as their long-lost homeworld, people in the Baronies generally do not hold Cradle in that same regard. Instead, Caracas, the Baronies' first world, occupies that venerated position in the cultural mythology. Cradle is simply recognized as their species' origin point, and not a homeland to be reclaimed, longed for, or even visited. Caracas was seeded by one of the earliest of the 10, the Apollo, a Titanic generation ship launched pre-fall. By all Union accounts, uncovered pre-fall records and early Baronic histories, the Apollo arrived above Caracas and successfully colonized the worlds. The early Apollonians became the founding generation of Caracans, who, over thousands of years of isolation, developed their own robust culture independent of Cradle, eventually coalescing into the trade barons of the narrative present. A largely inward-looking confederation, the Baronies do not seek to rule Union directly, though they do sit a representative on the Central Committee. Instead, they vie for control over Caracas. To sit the Baron of your house on throne Caracas is to rule the Baronies and set the policy that feeds Union's endless appetite. The Barons see the rule of Caracas as the ultimate goal. Everything else pales in comparison. Though their goal will always be to control the throne Caracas, the Barony is not entirely an insular culture. Numerous barons have interstellar aims and mount colonial expeditions, raise house companies, and engage with Union politics with varying motivations. Some for gold, some for glory, some for adventure, and some who see interstellar ventures as a unique angle back into Karrakin politics. The Baronies are the closest state in proximity to Cradle. Caracas. A palace world, Caracas is the capital of the Karrakin Trade Baronies, an oligarchic polytemporal dynastic federation in close proximity to Cradle. Caracas is home to Throne Caracas, the ancestral palace of the Karrakin people. Now a sprawling estate city grown to encompass nearly 8 million square kilometers, the original palace, the first colony of Caracas, was seeded pre-fall. It is now a living royal museum, an enclave set inside the Crown District of Caracas City that incorporates remaining artifacts of their generation ship into public monuments, art, and architecture. Caracas is a temperate world, a Gaia planet seeded pre-fall and left isolated during the Dark Age. It has developed divergent from Union for thousands of years, under the assumption that it alone had survived the fall. Recontact with Caracas and the Baronies first occurred via COM data packet transmissions sent from Union's first committee to ID pre-fall colony sites. Caracas, having flourished for nearly 7 millennia, responded rapidly. It would be a significant amount of time before physical contact was established, then in the form of conventional near-light ships sent from Union to Caracas. But for the Demos event and Union's meteoric technological ascendancy, Caracas would have been the seat of humanity's power. Unencumbered by the events of the fall, the colony on Caracas was well rooted on the world, and for thousands of years its people developed at conventional rates. By the time of the first contact with Union, they had made landfall on nearby worlds. By the time of the Demos event, they had developed mass industries and megastructural engineering, their population spread out over numerous terrestrial worlds and moons. More friction occurred under the Second Committee. Fearing significant resistance, which indeed they faced, the Second Committee sent a fleet before their diplomats. The war between the Karrakin peoples and the Union was short. The Union Navy smashed aside the Karrakin fleet and secured their surrender without making significant landfall on Caracas. Their fleet eliminated and faced by Union's singular control over paracausal entities and technology, burdened with a Baroque monarchy crippled by conventional interstellar communications and transportation, the Baronies took the unprecedented step, by their history and internal mythology, of ceding galactic sovereignty to Union. In return, Caracas became the raw heart of Union's industrial base, providing the hegemon with a vast boon of resources and extraction techniques that ensure Cradle and her colonies, by extension the rest of the core worlds of the galaxy, never want for any material good. The Barons, suddenly united by the Blink and the Omninet, chose not to demand rule over the galaxy, but to fund the people who did. In time, their economic sway has become inextricable from Union's galactic dominion. It is the grim truth of Union, and an uncomfortable tension among the Terrans that sit on the Central Committee, that whoever holds Caracas has at least one hand on the levers of Union's power. The Baronic embassy on Cradle is constantly trafficked by Union diplomats and officials, as is the Union campus on Caracas inundated by nobles and magnates. Caracas is the heart of the Baronies and is now home to the galaxy's premier naval and finishing college, the Royal Karrakin Admiralty. Pro-Union houses view attendance at the Admiralty as a necessary path for their children, and service as an honorable achievement. They are happy to send their children to the college, often at great temporal cost to their families, as local blink is far less developed in the Baronies than in Cradle. This, some barons grumble, by design. Following the introduction of mechanized chassis as a warfighting machine, the Karrakin Cavalry College adapted the new technology and is now known for the quality, if not quantity, of officer and machine its cohorts produce. While attendance and service to the Admiralty is still viewed as the most prestigious track for a barony youth, attendance and service in the cavalry is a parallel honor, one more martial than mental. Caracas through the years has remained the jewel in the Baronic crown, a conservative, traditional world with rigid social structures, rituals, and protocols. Lit as well by small but bright cosmopolitan centers, Caracas nonetheless is the political and cultural heart of the Baronies. No one writes poems or odes to Cradle in Baronic space. Caracas has replaced that old world in the heart of the Baronic nobility and their subjects. There are public and royal grounds on Caracas, the division between the two areas heavily policed by royal guards, artificial or natural walls, and lander access. Non-Baronic subjects are only welcome on Caracas by invite or diplomatic or economic mission. Other worlds in the Baronic concern may have similar prohibitions, but none as strict as the capital. What follows is a brief history of how the modern Baronic state came to be. The long, deep quiet. The Baronies, though they were not yet the Baronies as we know them today, survived the fall and are a source of record for the corresponding Dark Age on Cradle. They, along with the Onic peoples, are the result of a successful colonization effort by pre-fall humanity to ensure the survival and propagation of the human species. The fall is not the great filter moment in the Baronic history as it is in Union's cultural history. Its great cost is not as traumatic in the Baronic consciousness as it is in the Terran consciousness, though cultural memory of the era recalls some periods of unease. As the fall occurred throughout Cradle, the Karrakin project entered its second half of its first millennium of stability and growth. As stations and smaller colonies fell silent one by one, Caracas flourished, its small population growing rapidly, spreading across a lush world rich with water, food, and air. In the planetary governor's offices, there was some concern over the long collapse back on Cradle, but concern was as far as the planetary administration seemed inclined to express. Short of offering their land as a refuge to any who could reach them, or offering words of concern, there was nothing the Karrakin project could do to help those left on Cradle. The planetary governor's solution, as the fall dragged on and Caracas continued to grow healthy and independent of Cradle, was to simply shutter their communications platform and devote the entirety of their administrative and technological expertise to managing the world they could grow. Memo issued on the account of cessation of communication between Earth and 6KA-02B, Caracas. For public release, authored by the Office of the Governor. My fellow citizens, it is with a heavy heart that I must inform you of our sister world's silence, and issue a standing order of emergency administration. Earth, our one-time home and the kind mother of our race, issued this morning a diaspora-wide Notice of Independent Mandate, indicating that the administration is unable to continue in any effective central capacity. This message was sent with the correct verification and signature. Repeated attempts to contact our relay point were met with an automated response that further confirmed the administration's message. This means that, as of this morning, Earth no longer holds fulcrum over the affairs of the galaxy. Providence has ordained that we must face this next chapter of our history alone. Pursuant to our colonial charter and the emergency powers defined therein, I have furloughed the Citizen Advisory Council in order to more effectively manage the affairs of the colony until such time that we have established minimum viability. Ours is the great project now. Upon our shoulders rest the hopes, dreams, and histories of all those who have come before, and the potential of all those who have yet to be. It is no longer Earth where humanity will make its glory, but here, in our land, on this world, Caracas. It is incumbent that each person of Caracas that we do not despair. Earth has not left us, only given us the great mission. Indeed, we may see her fair azure light during our darkest nights, and know that she watches us in her temporary repose. We are a hardy race, and it is with a trust in the same Providence that gave us this burden that I trust we have not heard the last of Earth, and that we shall succeed in our endeavors. In time, Earth shall reach out to us once more, and we will do what we can to assist her, as she did for us when we were young. Until then, our project does not change. Caracas must be built, and must shine now as a light to beckon all humanity home. God bless this project, and all who work on its behalf. God bless us, the hope of humanity. Prior to public release. The planetary governor, or any officer acting in that role, shall be issued full theater control, commensurate with the emergency administration powers outlined in the planetary charter. The Citizen Advisory Council shall be furloughed until further notice, though informed prior to any new edicts. Upon formal cessation of communications with Earth, the head of the clergy shall offer a solemn prayer. The head of the colonial security shall post guards at all storehouse, warehouse, supply depots, power stations, medical buildings, administrative buildings, and so on. To the hundreds of thousands of new Karrakin citizens, none of whom had ever walked Cradle's Earth, much less known of the world as anything other than a name in text, or an abstract idea, or as a place represented in histories and media, Cradle, and by extension, old humanity's fall, was a tragedy, but not their end. To early Caracans, and the same holds true in the narrative present, the only home they have ever known, the only prize to be won, and the only motherlands they've ever had was Caracas. The fall swept over Cradle and, for a time, extinguished its light. Caracas was left alone, and far from being gripped by the terror of isolation, its people found themselves free of a distant rule. They could, they discovered, rule themselves, and so they did, for a time. A headless Leviathan, a melee without honor. Following the cessation of communications with Earth, Cradle, the planetary governor of Caracas took steps to secure his control over the colony, dissolving non-essential civic bodies and enacting a wide portfolio of autocratic laws under power granted to him by the colony's charter emergency provisions. Across Caracas, in secondary and tertiary colony sites with small, largely metropole-dependent populations, people assented. However, the colony's municipal core, people responded with surprise and anger. Earth was a distant world, one not well known to them, nor one that they saw themselves dependent upon. For their governor to claim emergency powers and dissolve key oversight committees was a step too far in their eyes. The city center erupted in mass protests in response to the planetary governor's declaration. In response, the governor orders his colonial security forces to break up the demonstrations. Their response is briefly noted in Karrakin histories as the Capitol Massacre. The killing set off a rolling year-long conflict that tore the colonial administration apart. However, it was not the massacre alone that drew Caracas down into the melee. The colonial security forces' guns fell silent over the massed bodies of the dead, and the footage of the massacre filtered out over the world, leaving a populace stunned by barbaric slaughter, and for a short while the planetary governor had his peace. But then scheduled imports of advanced goods and technology never arrived in Caracas orbit, crippling the world's advanced industries. Caracas medical infrastructure, orbital and local space programs, long-range communications, advanced goods import, machine mind dependence, off-site scientific testing, all left with nothing but whatever resources they had in storage or could craft, process, or extrude from local resources. As higher infrastructure collapsed for want of resource injection from Earth, a slow, if formally steady process, brushfire conflicts erupted across the city. Effective political resistance to the planetary governor's rule emerged in a second round of mass demonstrations. Only this time, the demonstrators came armed. Barricades grew in the streets of Caracas as sympathetic administrators inside the colonial government worked to slow, misdirect, and stymie any effective official response. The people of Caracas were winning, and the planetary governor's core of loyalists distanced themselves from him, fleeing before the popular resistance. Successful as the revolution was, it had terrible consequences for secondary and tertiary colonial sites the world over, who relied on the metropole's administrative and logistic capability to keep them in good supply and communication. Without any stable regime to coordinate Caracas' resource distribution, those secondary and tertiary sites, small outlying towns, installations, farmlands, all with populations in the low hundreds, began to wither, mirroring in miniature the populated galaxy's collapse. The capital revolution proved successful, but it saved only those who survived and lived in the city. Secondary and tertiary sites, if they did not fold, were forced into their own crisis states. Some banded together due to proximity, and others made desperate attacks on their neighbors to secure hoarded resources for themselves. The city was a bloodbath, block by block partisan conflict. The secondary and tertiary colony sites hide largely forgotten stories of small-scale terror. The melee lasted for roughly a decade, quieting in the latter half as regional powers coalesced around self-styled kings and queens, warlords in plain language, who held monopoly over resources and production facilities they secured in the initial eruption of violence. Caracas proper was administered by a citizen council following the planetary governor's abdication, and focused on rebuilding and recontacting the outlying towns. A crown of earth and stars. Pasa-Galia, the name of the first king in Karrakin history. Pasa-Galia is a mutable canvas in the modern Karrakin culture narrative, that of a uniter, a warlord, of an example of the Karrakin will to rule, and of hubris. In his youth, Pasa-Galia united Caracas into a single world, defined the global capital, and laid the foundation for throne Caracas. By his death, he planted both the seeds of Caracas' expansion into an interplanetary empire and the next great conflict to suffer the state. Beyond broad strokes given by the primary documents indicating the possible locations of his birth, the details of his early life are not that well known. This is likely the result of extensive record expungement campaigns his viziers and advisors embarked upon at his demand. This is not the stance of the modern baronies, but Pasa-Galia's suppression efforts were so thorough that few records remain. Apocrypha does exist, but Pasa-Galia's agents worked with judicious dedication to round up and destroy any histories outside of the approved mythologies. What remains, beyond rare hard copies of ancient texts, is a largely sanitized version of a life and its consequences, a mythology of ladder climbed and the throne under which the world was united. Here is what is known. Following the chaos of the melee period, Caracas entered an age of relative calm, one balanced on a knife point. The once unified colony had fractured into 5 city-states, 4 were organized each under a powerful monopole ruler, and the 5th is what remained of Caracas' Consensus Council. Barony histories are scant on this period, but footnotes indicate that the Consensus Council in Caracas City folded under the pressure of neighboring city-states eager to annex the riches of the feeble capital. Caracas City, following the melee, was no longer the colony's metropole. A victim of repeated raids from neighboring city-states, it became a corpse to be picked over and scavenged from. The 4 remaining city-states, or the Cousins, Laurent, Race, Cosimo, and Delamar, named after their respective rulers, divided up the remains of Caracas City into a series of messy 4-party sorties, street-to-street skirmishes, fought over the remaining technologies, machine mines, inexhaustible energy supplies, auto-fabricators, refineries, and so on. With the once capital city in no man's land dividing the Cousins, a long stalemate followed, a period, according to Karrakin dramas at least, of small party combat, an age of scavengers and skulkers. It was into this stable, hard-scrabble period that Pasa-Galia was born. Karrakin histories would have the reader believe that Pasa-Galia was born to a small, ignoble family pledged to serve the city-state of Reyes, and its ruler, Pasha Reyes. A commoner by birth, Pasa-Galia was the 3rd of 5 brothers. Their prior lives to Assumption are written as simple and pastoral parables of virility, good planning, and filial piety. It is in the humble wheat field that Pasa-Galia and his brothers developed the foundations of their martial prowess. It is in the humble wheat field, too, that Pasa-Galia and his brothers are first tested by the world he would later conquer. As a youth, Pasa-Galia worked in the vast wheat fields of the Reyes, a low-lying, primarily agricultural city-state in the outer rings of the ruins of Caracas City. Raiding parties were common and the child mortality rates were high. Ignoble families often banded together in many family communal complexes led by consensus councils pledged to their city-state's pasha. They would tithe a significant percentage of their harvest to the pasha, who, in turn, would raise, train, equip, and maintain standing security forces. Unaffiliated raiders, food scavengers out from the ruins of Caracas City, would often mount raiding parties that targeted these communes. Similarly, flagged raiders from rival city-states would, in times of diplomatic tension, mount attacks on these communes targeting fields, structures, and laborers. This back-and-forth raiding had replaced large wars, as no pasha had really sought to upend the larger Selenical trade structure that kept all of them roughly equivalent in strength. A later portion of Pasa-Galia's epic reveals that this was by design. The pashas held peace councils, meetings to negotiate how many raids they would allow on their farms in exchange for guarantees that no larger battles would be fought. They all feared the terrible violence that could bring, and were comfortable with the comparatively small number of dead they buried each year, and the stability that locking in that system promised. Pasacalia's family was a part of such commune that the Pashas negotiated away. Surviving epic poems that document the era speak of Pasacalia's commune coming under constant attack. They note that his family once had 15 brothers, likely from different members of the commune, and that one was killed each year until only Pasacalia and his last 4 brothers remained. At the urging of his mothers, Pasacalia begged audience with the Pasha Reyes, imploring him to act in defense of his home. He was refused. The next year, another brother was killed, and again he begged audience and action, and was again refused. The year after, his eldest and favorite brother was slain, and he begged once more, and was once more refused. 3 times refused, and with his home filled with the weepings of his mothers and the absence of his brothers, Pasacalia and his last remaining brother, Anaxadron, decided that they must act. They devised a plan and brought it to their mothers, who in turn offered it to the soldiers garrisoned there. They felt this to be a proper thing to do, given that, along with the brothers and the grain, the small garrison had suffered terribly. Pasacalia would seek the scavenger kings and waste lords of Caracas City, and offer them their commune's tithe in exchange for weapons and soldiers to kill Pasha Reyes. Meanwhile, Anaxadron would remain in the commune and would use the cover of the long, deep stillness of the winter months to spread Pasacalia's message, that Pasha Reyes was derelict in his duty to them, that he was a weak Pasha, who would see them dead rather than warm and safe, and that Pasacalia would return in spring to bring the people a better rule. The small garrison at Pasagalia's commune agreed to the plan, and soon Pasagalia and a small group of the soldiers there left under the cover of storm and darkness. The dead months of winter were upon them, when all communes fell silent and buttoned up to the winter chill. No raiding occurred, as it was out of season. Few would venture out into the inclement weather, certainly not the Pasha's tithemen, and so the small band had a few months in which they could enact their plan. When the spring thaw came, so would the Pasha's tithemen, to account for how many had died in the winter and dictate which field should be sown. Into the dead, ancient city Pasagalia and his band ventured. When spring came, so did Pasagalia. This time at the head of a great army of the lost and forgotten, armed and armored with ancient weapons of status. They marched with one target, Pasha Reyes' stronghold, and flew an old banner, the black and gold of Caracas, the ancient unified colony. Pasha Reyes was blindsided by the attack, and his stronghold fell within the first day, all but his most loyal professional soldiers either surrendering or turning coat and joining with Pasagalia. Anaxadron's whisperings, his dead of night stealing away to nearby communes, his organization among the farmers and their levies, had made a land fecund with revolutionary spirit. When Pasagalia himself threw open the doors of the dead Pasha's stronghold, he was welcomed with cheers and cries of Pasha. The people nominated him to sit on the throne of the city-state of Reyes. From Reyes, Pasagalia would launch a campaign that toppled the 3 other city-states within a decade. The facts of Pasagalia's reign are buried, often literally, in the depths of Karrakin mythos. What hard facts remain are few, owing in large part to the Tyrannis contra patrum, and the subsequent Narentum rebuilding effort of the dynastic Lade. Beyond the founding legend of Pasagalia, the archaeological record and written text are all that remain of Pasagalia's rule. His death, however, was not the end of his rule. For a time, Anaxadron ruled over the world, and then successive heirs of Pasagalia and later intermarried families in what became the Anorum Pasagalia. From ancient texts and corroborating evidence on Caracas, its terrestrial moons, and its sister worlds, we can surmise that the Anorum Pasagalia lasted for at least 1,000 years in its mature form. Given the presence of ruins dating to the Anorum Pasagalia on worlds and moons in proximity to Caracas, we can be assured that some form of the Anno Pasagalia was able to place populations off-world. Indeed, while the Anorum Tyrannis placed the foundations of Karrakin spaceflight under his rule, suppressed and subsequently uncovered records indicate that the Anorum Pasagalia was the first indigenous Karrakin space program. Pasagalia and the Anorum Pasagalia are topics of interest in the modern Baronic consciousness, especially among an emerging political movement that has adopted his name, the Pasacalians. Pasagalia's artifacts and histories represented a largely lost part of Karrakin history. A pre-tyrannic, pre-Baronic period of history prior to the advent of the noble houses and ruling cartels, one far older than the previous histories would have the public believe. Pasagalia's rule is not necessarily viewed as a counter-Baronic ideology or icon. He was an absolute monarch, after all, one that established a dynastic monarchy that ruled the world for 1,000 years or more, and as such, his newly revealed histories are not suppressed. Transgression for the modern Pasagalian is found in the simple fact that the ancient Pasagalia's rule was suppressed. The Anorum Pasagalia would not reign in perpetuity. An apocryphal story, uncovered well after the end of the Anorum Tyrannis, speaks of a young Pasagalia meeting an oracle on the road to Caracas. and the vision of the future spoken to him there. In winter, the rest time for the Four Lands, Pasa-Galia and their band did venture to Caracas, the ancient city of God-birth. There they sought the tyrant of Caracas, a great warrior named Batalji. The road was long and desperate, and many did die, as their armor did not to warm them, and their cloth was thin and torn, and their bellies were empty. All nights were cold and deep, but Pasa-Galia was of good cheer, and his captains did lend them their heat, as Pasa-Galia shared it with them, as was wanted. It was on a cold and bitter night like this that Pasa-Galia saw a ghost light bobbing in the falling snow. "Do not chase it," one loyal captain urged Pasa-Galia. "It is a ghost light, to bewitch travelers. In summer it leads to death. Surely it begets the same in winter, if not worse." But Pasa-Galia, always in good cheer, for they had already took their fill of suffering under the Pasha, and grief was their name after 10 and 3 of their brothers had died, took up their spear Tui and said to their beloved captain, "Take heart, O captain. I am only a humble farm boy, and you a strong soldier. If I fall, you will take up my name and carry my dream in your breast farther than I." And Pasa-Galia left, and chased the ghost light through the howling snow, and came to a small ruin of a home where the ghost light was trapped. "Little Ember," Pasa-Galia called to the light, "why have you led me here? What message do you carry for my ears?" And from a deeper shadow yet in the home a voice issued, saying, "Do not seek out the speaker of this voice. Listen only to my words and make no movements, and when I am done you will be guided back to your camp. I am Oracle, and I have seen the end of all stories. You are called Pasa-Galia, and your name will never be uttered in darkness. Before you lies 1,000 years of empire, yours if you continue along your path. But know this, to continue will only feed a terrible wheel, whose name is Dis, and whose appetite is vast as the starlit sky. Will you continue?" Pasa-Galia, without hesitation, said to the oracle, "Yes. Pasha has doomed my mothers and killed my brothers. I must continue. Why will this turn your terrible wheel?" And the oracle said, "Your empire would be built at the tip of a spear, your fields watered with arrows and then bullets, and then coherent particles. You would build a monument to your brothers and mothers, and you would form it from the ash and bone of the brothers and mothers of your enemies, and hear only the cheers of your people, and not the cries of the children of those innumerable dead. This, Pasa-Galia, is the fuel for the wheel that consumes the empire made by brave young heroes like you." This ponderous whinging curdled Pasa-Galia's fair features into a terrible mask of hate, and so storming into the back of the small house, they found the oracle there, a creature wrapped in rags. Pasa-Galia threatened the oracle with Tui at its neck, and said, "Speak no more, oracle, but to beg for mercy. You do not know the life I have suffered. You have not heard the cries of my brothers or the wailing of my mothers, nor the hope my words bring to those who have suffered as I have." And the oracle, laughing, said, "Do you think I fear death, Pasa-Galia? I, who have seen the great wheel Dis grind across my own sky and gave it name? I, who have heard countless times those very words spoken from mouths like yours? I, who has lived and who has died? I, who has gained this knowledge and many other secret ones?" So Pasa-Galia stabbed the oracle through the throat with Tui, and the oracle laughed and said, "You are braver than most, Pasa-Galia, and a fool who must learn. Go, build your empire. I will meet you again at the end." And the oracle died, though there was no blood, and when Pasa-Galia tore off the creature's robes, they found not a man as they thought, but a golem in the shape of a man, made with like skin, with black blood and green blood, and saw many ghost lights blinking where its eyes should be. Pasa-Galia took the oracle's cloak, finding it a fine and sturdy thing, and left their spirit Tui and returned to their camp. There, Pasa-Galia took comfort in their captains, and forgot the words of the oracle, and continued to Caracas, where they would build their empire. The Last Argument of Kings. The end of the Anorum Pasa-Galia comes thousands of years after its establishment, prompted by a combination of internal strife, administrative corruption, cultural divergence, and the consequences of relativity. Caracas had been founded by a post-information age humanity. Any society on Caracas would have had access to the technologies and knowledges of the culture that cast them there. What they often lacked was the education and infrastructure to employ the technologies, sciences, theories, and disciplines that they had access to. Under the Anorum Pasa-Galia, and under all subsequent civilizations on Caracas, humans on Caracas developed the necessary physical, cultural, and mental infrastructures to take from that base of knowledge, depending on their access and support, to achieve great leaps in development. As parallel consequence, often divergent or otherwise anachronistic spurs of development exist. One such spur is evidenced in the third millennia of history on Caracas. In the Anorum Pasa-Galia's multi-world imperial purview, a tremendous feat of cultural and civilizational achievement that, for a time, was sustainable, if ponderous in its bureaucracy, this interplanetary empire held for centuries after its establishment, though its foundation in the medial Anorum Pasa-Galia period would set the seeds for its end. The Anorum Pasa-Galia's interplanetary empire was built on the back of a conventional space program. Massive, largely automated ships ferried goods and information back and forth between worlds after initial colonies were established, with manned voyages between worlds being rare and notable things. Any manned voyage was the result of tremendous investment by either the throne or wealthy consortiums of merchants sufficient capital. Likewise, colonization efforts were the product of tremendous investment in fanfare. At its height, the Anorum Pasa-Galia could count a number of terrestrial colonies as member states under its throne, with the permanent population of those likely numbering less than 1 million souls. The Anorum Pasa-Galia's imperial portfolio counted 9 worlds colonized, in addition to Caracas' second largest moon, Arudai. Caracas remained the capital, with Arudai as the second most populated territory in their portfolio. Beyond, the Anno granted colonial charters to some of the Emperor's most favored emirs and nobles. At the Anorum Pasa-Galia's height, they held the following worlds: Caracas, the homeworld of the Karrakin people and prime seat of the Anorum Pasa-Galia, now the capital of the Trade Baronies; Arudai, Caracas' second largest moon, gifted to descendants of Pasa-Galia the First Brother, and Axedron; Ispasalar, the first colonized world following the settling of Arudai, the charter world of the Delamar family; Talimsan, the charter world of the descendants of the Laurent family; Iolet A, a small moon and mining station in orbit above Iolet 1, a massive gas giant; Kairadin, a colony of the Anno; Umara, a colony of the Anno; Begum, a colony of the Anno; Bo, a colony of the Anno. Ultimately, the effort of managing these worlds, much less the hundreds of millions of subjects on Caracas, frayed the institutions that kept the Anorum Pasa-Galia running smoothly. As the throne's interest turned towards nearby worlds and stars, the home front grew more and more dissatisfied with the successor Pasa-Galian emperors. Recovered texts show that a series of ineffectual leaders cast the Anno into a deeply corrupt, unsustainable spiral, with ministers favoring certain colonies over Caracas, and certain districts on Caracas over other districts. Colony worlds grew divergent ideologies as communication lag started to take its toll. Ministers dispatched to corral the colonies grew idle and independent as the true distance and difficulty of sublight interplanetary administration made itself known. Similarly, zealous ministers grew more brutal, enforcing the Anno's law with draconian enthusiasm. From Caracas, the journey out to the even closest non-moon colony took a staggering amount of time for pre-Panacea humans. Years of real-time travel experienced as long and boring months for the crew on board, and often when a minister arrived on the world they were meant to manage, they found the political realities on the ground had changed from their briefings. Ports grew fat with the wealth of worlds, and custom officials skimmed shipments for their own enrichment. After all, the world they were destined for wouldn't discover the discrepancy between manifest and storage for years, decades, or even centuries in some cases. The tensions boiled over with the Independence Declaration of the Karrakin, a middle-distance colony home to a few 100,000 souls. Announcing their intent to secede from the Anno, Karrakin declared itself a free republic with the intent and ability to manage its own affairs. The Anno was too far away and too concerned with fattening its own coffers and belly off the labor of the Karati people. They would stop their tithe, turn away ministers sent to the world, and refuse any communication that did not treat them as a sovereign global nation. The Anno responded by sending one of their most loyal generals, Tyrannis of Delamar, with a flotilla of ships and soldiers to suppress the rebellion. The transit from Caracas to Karrakin took them roughly a decade real time. By the time they arrived in orbit about Karrakin, the Karati were ready, and the situation in the Anno had changed dramatically. From arrival, the Karati plagued Terran ships with surface-to-orbit missiles, destroying a number of the general's shuttles before his soldiers were able to land. When they did disembark, they found the Karati had built their colony sites into a fortress and trained their people into a militia. This did not change the outcome of the suppression war that followed, but ensured that the ensuing fight was a brutal affair. Tyrannis' campaign ended a handful of years after landfall. A communications packet arrived in system ordering a halt to any engagements by word of the Emperor, or rather, the Emperor Apparent, currently in transit to Caracas from an outlying colony world. A series of conflicting communication packets followed, evidently sent in close proximity to one another. The Emperor was dead, and his heir was en route. The heir was illegitimate, and a true successor had been seated on throne Caracas. The successor on the throne, by virtue of temporal anomalies due to relativistic travel, was actually younger than they claimed to be, and the true successor had declared their capital in Old Cozumel. The other colonies, as a result of the Emperor's passing, had followed Carrakin's example and declared themselves independent in myriad other scenarios. The effects of sublight relativistic travel have come home to Caracas, and the Anno had no method with which to deal with competing legitimate claims. The Anno, it appeared, had burst into a series of succession wars both at home and in the colonies. Unsure how to proceed, but exhausted by the current campaign, Tyrann halted his forces. He requested peace talks with the Kairati, who had also borne witness to the communication blast broadcasting system, and brokered a peace agreement. Tyrann and his army would leave Carrakin, de facto granting them their independence, and head home to Caracas and enforce peace until the true heir could be determined. At this time, and even after the war on Carrakin, Tyrann's army and its fleet was the most powerful professional fighting force the Anno had pulled together, rivaled only by the Imperial Guard garrisoned in Throne Caracas. His ranks bolstered some of the Kairati Anno loyalists. Tyrann and his army left Carrakin and began their long, isolated journey home. Prior to integration into Union, Karrakin space had no access to omninet communication or blink travel. While underway, messages between ships in transit and their destination were subject to often intense delay. It was protocol to quiet a ship's communication centers, save for a small officer corps who could timeline the messages, placing them in context before issuing them out to the crew. Tyrann's return was plagued by inbound messages, at first in bursts and then in a deluge the closer they drew towards Caracas. After a decade of real-time travel, Tyrann's army arrived. Gathering his ships in orbit above Caracas, he met with his communications officers aboard his flagships and opened communications with Caracas. He was met with a cacophony, a confusion of competing calls for his ship's identities and loyalties. Various factions on Caracas and in local space demanding to know who he fought for, ultimatums and demands for him to surrender his weapons. Seeking reprieve from the many factions targeting beams, firing solutions, and encroaching picket ships, Tyrann announced himself and his army as acting service of Caracas. His officer corps worked hard to determine the situation on the ground. Who his allies were, who ruled the Anno, and which of the factions encroaching on their fleet space posed the largest threat. Their initial survey returned grim data. Caracas was crisscrossed with muddy wasteland battlescapes, long networks of static trench lines spidered out around factories, cities, and strategic points, packed with millions of conscripted soldiers, peasant levies, and mercenaries. Whole forests burned or had been burned away. Throne Caracas had been bombed to rubble at Hedres, Cosimo, and Delamar. A massive crater marked the northern pole of Caracas, where a projectile launched by separatists of Isla A had flung an asteroid into the world. The Emperor was missing, as were the many heirs who claimed birthright and raised armies from the world's population. Beyond Caracas, 5 of the Anno's worlds, Isfalar, Carradin, Islet A, Tilimsan, and Begum, had declared their independence, embroiling the Imperial Guard and its remaining ships in a slew of colonial suppression operations. Tyrann and his army had stepped into a multi-part polytemporal struggle to determine the heir of the Rise of Pasa-Galia, and the first interplanetary war in human history. Exhausted, his leader dead with no clear heir, his home city reduced to rubble, his home world cold under a blanket of ash, rain, and stagnating trench warfare, Tyrann made his move. His response to all hails was simple, a curt statement now immortalized at the base of his monument on Caracas. I serve the people of Caracas and its throne. Tyrann ordered his battleships to open fire upon all ships encroaching on his fleet, and for his army to prepare for one last invasion, this time of Throne Caracas. Tyrann's campaign was swift and brutal, targeting from orbit the presumed headquarters of all heirs, all military production plants, and garrisons of significant size. His fleet, even 2 decades out of date, was the largest concentration of military ships and ordnance ever put into space. Furthermore, their campaign on Carrakin had primarily been a ground campaign, one of small-scale anti-guerrilla operations fought in heavily populated civilian environments, with little use for ship-to-ship or ship-to-surface ordnance. The volume of ordnance rained down on Caracas was terrible enough to trigger global seismic activity, destabilizing and demoralizing the entrenched peasant levies and conscript armies. At night, during the early days of Tyrann's landing, the sky was lit with a brilliant novae of successor ships flaring nuclear as Tyrann's battleships engaged all comers who did not surrender themselves to his mandate. This opening salvo, Tyrann's landing, would mark the end of the Rise of Pasa-Galia. For the better half of a week, Tyrann's battle-worn veterans fought in the halls of the massive Throne Caracas complex, rooting out the last of the beleaguered Imperial Guard that refused to surrender. The throne itself was breached on the 7th day of the invasion, with Tyrann leading the first wave into the facility. There they found the last of the Imperial Guard, their most high commanders and diehard veterans, and engaged them in a brutal melee at the foot of the throne where the rotted skeletal corpse of the last emperor slouched. Tyrann and his soldiers were victorious, and oral histories record the moments where he climbed the steps to the imperial body and, after removing its crown, threw the desiccated corpse down. The first time I visited Throne Caracas, I did so against the guns of the Imperial Guard. I was a man aligned in Tyrann's contrapatrum, a veteran of his wars on Karrakin and a long journey between worlds. I was born on Ispasalar, and an old man of 53, as I perceived it, when we stormed the throne. I had never breathed the royal air. I would not breathe it for years, as my sealed suit was necessary to keep me from dying. I promised myself, I remember this, as our dropship carried me through flak, that I would one day return in the warm sun of peace, and breathe royal air, for it must be sweet to be kept from us. The battle to that point had been one fought under the stern faces of patricians and Pasa-Galians, those who had ruled us from times since before I could remember, in stone and monument. These the ancient halls wandered only by the bare feet of Pasa-Galia's thousand children. These ancient halls only ever kissed by the sound of laughter and song, now the booted trump of soldiery and the thunder sound of our cannon and gun. Did I profane the place I fought to save? Can one profane a place corrupted by the ones who haunt it? Question for robed men and women, not for me. My task was to fight. I led a unit of men align. Some of the sons of those elders who had left with us for Carradin, others my brothers in age and veterancy. By the enormous word, we had seen all the world in void but for its heart. Caracas, fair one. My veterans had been cast out of this garden, I, as I said, from a neighboring plot, to a distant, ungrateful land of mud and haze, told our prize was to claim it for the crown, this throne. We did and were abandoned. By vote our voice we demanded our right, and Tyrann promised it. So who else would we follow? None but him. From the belly of our dropship, under ashen royal skies, we fought to the heart of the throne. I laid low many by harsh shot and blade, and was the first to the great sealed doors of the Pasa-Galian throne. Craterus and Antigonus, my seconds, had been wounded, but they held each other up, slouched over their belt feds. I had cut a loophole in the golden doors with my pen beam, and felt a responsibility for their wounds as the Imperial Guards had shoved their weapons from behind the hole and blasted blind towards us. Brave Craterus fired back, striking many of them, hollering Antigonius's name, for he loved him dearly. His efforts saved Antigonus and I, and the rest of my men, and silenced the Imperials within. I had never wanted a drink more than how my throat begged for slake in that moment. Raw, I remember the word over and over. Raw like hot sand baked firm under Diadachi's unwavering light. A hush. This, too, is what I remembered. A hush that fell over the battle, an oppressive veil that descended upon all combatants. The Imperials inside the doors of the throne even ceased their damnable singing. Tyrann approached, and placed his hand upon Antigonus, and spoke whispers to him. And fair Antigonus did stand to his full height to place his own hand on Tyrann's enameled shoulder. Craterus rose from his slouch cover, and Tyrann lifted him up and placed his hand on the opposite shoulder. And I stood to the side, and Tyrann smiled, and spoke to me, saying, "The Imperials resist beyond this door?" And to him I could not speak, but nod, and he drew his glittering sword made from starfall, and pointed it to the door, and commanded it open. And there was a moment of great groaning protest, and then the door swung open, and from it charged the Imperials. A great and bloody melee ensued, Antigonus and Craterus and I standing in the personal guard to Tyrann himself, at the head of our great army as it clashed in the corridors of the throne. We traded blow and blade with the lords and the glorious commanders of the Empire, whose names were blessed themselves by Pasa-Galia's own lips, and whose raiments were the finest electrum and adamantine, whose weapons smoked with light heat, whose own forms were not the containers of their own will. We struck them down, made mortal once more their soft imperial flesh. Each bite my bayonet 8 of them, a land was made free in posterity. Ours was the righteous fight, the setting of a broken bone. As we tore them down, we made a land whole. And then the last fell, and the long tall steps up to the throne itself Tyrann did walk. None attempted to follow, but to fall upon a knee, mutter a prayer for water and peace, and thanks for a life beyond this one. I watched as Tyrann, approaching the royal form of the dead emperor, did set down his starfall blade, did lift from the royal form the heavy crown of empire, did throw the royal form down its sepulchre throne, and sitting himself upon it, rest the heavy crown on his own head, and speak to us his true name, Tyrannis. Excerpt from the Memoir and Notes of Baron Cassander End of the House of Glass. After declaring himself Tyrannis, a significant number of the successor's claimants, levies, and conscripts around the throne Caracas surrendered and pledged their service to him. No other claimant was able to sit on the throne, therefore Tyrannis must be the true successor. Tyrannis landing is widely regarded in the Baronies now as a cruel but necessary action, the only way, histories record, of breaking the stalemate, as a broken bone must be reset in order to heal, a prominent text writes. So too did Tyran need to reset the Anorum. Anorum Tyrannis. Tyrannis' victory enthroned Caracas, and the capitulation of the conscript ranks did not mean he conquered and healed the world of Caracas or the galaxy at large. Indeed, his early position was desperate at best. Caracas, after all, was a world 20 years into a war of attrition, with a population numbering just under 2 billion souls and an average development level akin to a Bell-esque/pastoral preserve prior to the start of the Succession War. Dethroning the corpse of the previous emperor only marked the beginning of Tyrannis' great project, to remake an empire in his image. The first steps to his project were to disseminate knowledge of his victory and dethroning of the current Pasa-Galia across Caracas and the empire. Then he needed to establish control over Caracas and the colonies. Finally, he needed to rebuild. The years immediately following Tyrannis' claim were marked by an uptick in fighting across the globe. Kept in supply by throne armories, Tyrannis' fleet was an unassailable orbital fortress, capable of launching soldiers and ordnance anywhere in the world with an average deployment time of a mere 90 minutes. Massed forces were atomized by orbital fire. Previously impenetrable battle lines were rendered pointless by shock troopers that could be dropped behind. Command bunkers could be pounded into dust under simple kinetic attacks. One by one, the ground-based successor claimants were rooted out. Their forces either subsumed into Tyrannis' ranks or slaughtered by weaponry that defeated every defense they could muster. The claimants themselves, if they were captured, were given an ultimatum: recant your claim, then die. Tyrannis' armies swept across the world led by the veterans of his Karrakin campaign, his old corps of loyal soldiers come nobility under the Anorum Tyrannis. Kilometer by kilometer, Caracas falls under Tyrannis' banner, and in the space of another decade the world is pacified. Old imperial loyalists, artifacts of the Anorum Pasa-Galia and the millennia prior, old lands and city-states, all markers of any previous age, were destroyed. The resetting of the previous Anorum was a grim period among grim periods in Caracas' history. Tyrannis was not above the use of secret police, widespread censorship, and ideological purges in order to achieve its political aims. Evident brutality aside, the people of Caracas, and certainly those not exposed to the cruel capabilities of Tyrannis and his armies, largely celebrated his ascension and the announcement of the new Anorum. The Pasa-Galia's interfamily spats, after all, started the succession war that sent tens of millions of people to their death. Tyrannis had the will and the power to end it. His hold on Caracas secured, Tyrannis and his advisors turned their Anorum eye to the next frontier, the colonies. Left to their own devices for nearly 4 decades, 20 years of filicidal wars on Caracas, 10 years of unification conflicts on the world, and a handful of years under the new Anorum, had organized into their own Anorums, republics, and states. Ignored by the crown, the colonies continued to fight, developing interplanetary combat doctrines, small scale but advanced, and their own histories, cultures, and identities. Peace was secured by force and ensured by force. In this early period of his Anorum, Tyrannis announced the creation of his royal line. He established a new nobility from his loyal veterans. He announced reforms to expand the direct administration of Throne Caracas over Caracas at large, and an ambitious goal to expand the world's infrastructure, raising all from the pastoral to the post-industrial. The Anorum Tyrannis was to be marked by great works, Tyrannis often remarked. However, Tyrannis knew his claim would not be complete unless he could bring the colonies back under his dominion. With fanfare and glories promised to those who volunteered, he announced a second Unification Campaign, a return to the colonies in a future more prosperous than that of the previous Anorum. Those sons and daughters of his new nobility, as well as their fathers and mothers, would be offered fresh commissions and titles should they volunteer for service. Those of no rank could attain favored status among Tyrannis Anorum if they enlisted. For years, the foundries on Caracas churned out new ships, weapons, and armor for Tyrannis' armies. Levies and volunteers trained in terrestrial, orbital, and zero-G combat. Officer corps studied Tyrannis' strategies from the Karrakin and Karrakin campaigns. Astrologicians scoured the heavens for communication and signals between the colonies. With a broad suite of probes, telescopes, and observatories at their disposal, Tyrannis and his commanders built a working knowledge of colonial naval strategy, strength, and capabilities. Tyrannis' colonial campaign launched without him. His eldest son, Tyrannis, led the fleet. Tyrannis remained on Caracas, with his close advisors and his daughter Calendula, who he chose as his heir. Tyrannis' Anorum was still young when the fleet launched, just over 2 decades, and his presence was needed to maintain morale and cohesion on the home front. Histories record that, during the first reconquest of the Anno Tyrannis, the Aradai expedition, Tyrannis spent hours each night observing the progress of the battle from a balcony observatory, ignoring domestic obligations while he paced under the battlefield moon. Peacetime never appealed to Tyrannis, it would seem, and histories record that, for the duration of his campaign, his administrators ran the Anorum under direction of Calendula. Tyrannis' colonial unification campaign was not solely martial. Ahead of his great fleet, he dispatched emissaries aboard light, quick ships with messages of peace, gold tribute scavenged from Throne Caracas, and other displays of wealth and power. Wealth and power that, for at least in the early cases, Tyrannis did not actually have on Caracas. These emissaries were successful in convincing some of the worlds to pledge themselves to the Anorum, Isfalar, Chilabsan, and Bo. Following forced projections cast into the world's assembled leaders, others, chief among them Tyrannis' old rival, Karrakin, resisted. They were subject to the full strength of Targetti's fleets and armies and fell in time. The colonial unification campaign lasted for decades real time, and by its end, Tyrannis was on his deathbed. Calendula had already ascended to the throne and, essentially, ruled the Anorum, but a formal ceremony marking the transition of power was necessary. This Tyrannis wanted to hold off until Targetti's could return, to show to his subjects that there would be no conflicts over succession. Tyrannis wished to show the strength of his Anorum, but Calendula and her advisors urged haste. Tyrannis was near death, and Targetti's return would take more than a century. By the time he returned, Calendula's children would be of age and likely to sit on the throne. Depending on Targetti's disposition, another succession war could spark and tear down the Anorum Tyrannis. To prevent this scenario, Calendula called for Tyrannis and Targetti's to a dialogue, a summit via light in order to determine the correct course of action. The three of them met and discussed with their advisors and came to a previously unthinkable conclusion. The Anorum Tyrannis must end. Dynasticlade. Letter on the Dynasticlade sent by His Majesty Tyrannis, Emperor of the Anorum in his name. For immediate release across the Imperial Mundi to be broadcast on all platforms to be translated to all languages. Be it known to all. You who have heard this missive have heard the clarion ring of the new dawn. In 99 years, Imperial, Targetti shall return to the throne Caracas. You of advanced age know the terror of time, how it ravages families, splits business partners, and confuses lovers. To prevent another age of tumult, I, Tyrannis, do hereby issue the following command. Upon the death and passing of Tyrannis, Emperor of the Anorum in his name, his beloved daughter and heir, Calendula, Decurion of Throne Caracas, shall ascend to her imperial seat, naming no chosen to follow. She will rule from Throne Caracas, with a glad and golden sunset ever at her right hand. Targetti's, Hagiograph of the Anorum, in transit shall retain his title, subjects, and land, though make no claim over the rights and rules of the empire. He will not be your emperor, though his presence in Anorum space shall bring a warm glow to all our hearts. Upon the passing of my fair daughter Calendula, my Anorum shall end. Upon the passing of my fair daughter Calendula, my Anorum shall end. Upon the passing of my fair daughter Calendula, my Anorum shall end. My Anorum shall abdicate Throne Caracas. In its place will sit a council of my most honored advisors. They shall serve for 20 years, and in that time they will establish the correct and just procedures for each world to elect a representative to serve a term of another 20 years on this council. Abdication of this duty is abrogation to their right to rule, and all who see them shall be mandated to spit, curse, and strike them with my blessing. Mine shall be the final Anorum. You, my people, deserve more than a crown to rule you. You shall rule yourselves. His Majesty the Emperor Tyrannis, sole and final. The Dynasticlade, the orderly transfer of the Anorum Tyrannis from an imperial monarchy to new federation of noble states. Tyrannis would rule out the rest of his natural life. Calendula would ascend the throne and name no heirs, managing the transition as a stable leader. Targetti's, upon his return, would make no attempt to rule. His claim would be an honorary title, a chosen name, and an estate where he would manage the affairs of the royal family, continuing the Anorum in a ceremonial capacity. The impulse towards Dynasticlade was prompted by Tyrannis' experience of the bloody end of the Rise of Pasa-Galia. This step was an attempt to establish a transition from the imperial monarchy to a noble federation. There would be a council of rulers chosen from the nobility by the nobility. Each would be represented, and together they would decide the fate of all peoples. The old family names would be done away with, and new ones would be chosen. Each noble line in their world would be a single spoke of a wheel whose hub was Caracas. Without the hub, all would fail, and without the spokes, the hub would fail. This was the Dynasticlade, whose beginning would be marked by an unprecedented political reorganization and whose end would be defined by an epoch-defining watershed moment, the introduction of the Union of Caracas. The proposal, when announced to the empire at large, sent shockwaves through the nobility and peasantry both. The missive was broadcast to all worlds and ships in transit, printed and pasted to the walls of every city, cried out in town squares, and distributed to the public wherever they were. Tyrannis, who had ruled for nearly a century following the conclusion of the succession wars, was never a grand and generational ruler, but one affixed firmly in the minds of the Karrakin people as a great unifying figure. To have him promise not continued rule, but another fracturing, even one orderly as his dynastic clade, was worrying. Tyrannis abdicated before his death, crowning his daughter Calendula in a multi-day public ceremony on Caracas. He threw the doors of the throne Caracas wide open, allowing for the first time the common ranks of people inside the walled royal city. For those who couldn't make the journey to throne Caracas during the coronation, Tyrannis ordered public ferries to be dispatched and issued any who requested entrance a voucher that would allow them, or their descendants should they survive the journey, entrance for one day into the royal city. Caracas had not experienced a coronation since the last Pasa-Galian emperor. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the world was gripped not by war, but by celebration. This coronation marked the beginning of a new era. Calendula promised before the world that hers would be a rule of peace, a rule of unmaking the old ways in favor of new. Change, she is recorded as saying, is a promise made to our children, and an honor to our ancestors. Our people, in time immemorial, survived the death of a world. We now usher in the birth of a new one. As Calendula managed the affairs of Throne Caracas, the pilgrimages and the daily duties of speeches, remarks, and reassurances to the never-ending stream of petitioners to the fading throne, her advisor council worked to construct an electoral system that could coordinate roughly in sync across the Anorum. The first step was to codify an electoral class free of the ties of previous nobility and ranking. This they did by organizing the Houses of Worlds into nameless categories, determined by the world upon which they made their home. While their specific platforms and interests had changed since their initial establishment, the nameless houses still exist in the narrative present. They are now simply called the Major Houses. The Major Houses are as follows: the House of Order, whose capital world is Caracas; the House of Remembrance, whose capital world is the moon Arudai; the House of Glass, whose capital world is Isfasalar; the House of Sand, whose capital world is Tilimsan; the House of Smoke, whose capital world is the moon Islet A; the House of Stone, whose capital world is Caradin; the House of Water, whose capital world is Umara; the House of Moments, whose capital world is Begum; the House of Dust, whose capital world is Bo. While now the major houses primarily represent the interests of their managing trade cartels, their foundation had no such industrial or market delineation, nor their own internal nobilities or named persons. Instead, they were more in line with the party organizations meant to collect the people of one world into a simple, closed voting environment. The dynastic clade progressed with a surprising ease, as over the intervening years between Calendula's coronation and Tegeti's return, each world agreed to participate. Years of animosity against the crown, whole bloody histories of resistances and capitulation, of secret police and peasant levies, it all began to slip away, as the population of the colonies realized that their voice would be made equal in the halls of Caracas. If only they agreed to the terms of the dynastic clade. They would no longer be independent, but they would have the power in the form of their baronic representatives. The worlds, one by one, consented to participate in the new federation. The new houses were established. Peace was at hand. Hello out there. In the high desert observatories on Caracas, where the Anorum navigation monitored the orbital environment around the world, an old signal buoy, active since pre-Pasa-Galian times, pinged to life. This was an unusual, though not unprecedented, development. There were thousands of old signal buoys seeded through Karrakin local space, dumped in the world's Lagrange points, in various long and short orbits around the planet. They had been seeded millennia ago by the Apollo, powered by nuclear drives that, as far as the humans of Caracas were concerned, were inexhaustible. The buoys, old communication relays, data collection satellites, theater-building autocartographers, breadcrumb nodes, etc., were tracked but left alone unless they presented a danger to outbound or inbound orbital traffic. The buoy that pinged was a communication relay, a simple signal booster that accepted a tight beam laser communication, sighted its next point, and passed it on, cleaning the signal and boosting it to prevent too much data loss. In this case, it targeted the old towers of the Anorum navigation, maintained on Caracas since the earliest days of habitation by a series of professional monastic orders, cults, and at the time of contact, the skeleton crew of Anorum flight control operators closing up shop. It took the crew the better part of a week to realize that the old buoy was pinging, a simple binary message which they were able to translate following old guides into common, then into Karrakin. Hello out there. Do you read us? This is Union on Cradle, Earth, calling any survivors, descendants, of the Apollo. You are not alone. Attached are plans for contacting the sender of this message. This message will repeat until contact is made. The message contained plans to construct a compatible communications platform. But the Caracans had no need. They were able to tune an existing platform to the correct parameters and send their own message greeting Union. Message received. Who is Union? We are Karrakin. Our home is Caracas. Are you like us? Attached in the Karrakin reply was a broad portfolio of data containing images, text, music, and other cultural artifacts. The distance involved in the communication meant that any reply would take years to reach its intended recipient. So years later, after a measured rollout of the announcement, public response, and building speculation around what, if anything, Cradle would say in response, the Karrakins received Cradle's reply. Yes, we are. Good to hear we're not alone. Friends, we greet you in peace. Expect visitors sometime. Our doors are open. With this brief exchange of messages, Caracas entered a new era of interstellar politics. Its norm dissolved. The first test for its new federation was to figure out how to approach the senders of these transmissions. Data scraped from the type beams pointed back towards Earth, indicating that they were indeed sent from the world, a world largely forgotten by Karrakin culture, but rapidly growing to occupy a great public interest on account of it being the origin point of these messages. More messages flowed back and forth, cultural exchange occurring at a rate of once every 16 years. Soon, the messages began to return faster. Their origin point was a Union nearlighter en route to Caracas. The first effect the contact had on the Karrakin psyche was multifaceted. Some, chief among them the hagiographs, die-hard careerists of the new federal army, urged the barons to launch a fleet and meet the incoming ship. Others cautioned temperance and advised the barons approach not with military ships but with civilian vessels. In the end, they decided to review old protocols and grant the arriving nearlighter an honor guard, a mix of military ships and civilian yachts, arranged in an escort corridor. Protocol queries flew back and forth between the approaching nearlighter and Caracas, establishing diplomatic handshakes, sharing health data and vaccination information, language guides, and other contextualization/introduction information. The Karrakins learned a more detailed history of Union in the First Committee, and for the first time were able to place themselves in a coherent timeline. Accordingly, administrative and cultural reforms were announced across the new federation, part of an ongoing package of reforms already underway as part of the transition from a norm to federation. The new federation is remembered today for their peaceful welcome of these Union representatives, their insistence on reintegration under the Union standard timeline, and their inability to effectively address Union's political influence in the following centuries. While communication between Union and the new federation in this period was initially peaceful, this peace would prove unsustainable. On Caracas and other worlds of the Federation, resistance to reforms was beginning to coalesce around the surviving members of the enormous Tyrannis. Tagetes and his children, who were ceremonial cultural leaders, important figures whose favor was still sought even if they held no legal political power, and reactionary fervor spurred by delusional hagiographs angered by the Federation's attacks on Karrakin culture. Meanwhile, on Cradle, a growing anthro-chauvinist movement recoiled at the idea that Union's mantle could reasonably be threatened by this distant cousin, and others on the far side of their space, and were beginning to agitate for a more direct form of rule. For the space of a few centuries, there was an uneasy peace between the two stellar nations. Communication and cultural exchange were solely restricted to data packet transfers and automated near-light ships, with early patterned inorganic machine minds handling the rigors of any physical journey. The relationship between the First Committee and the new Federation was top-heavy. At the grassroots, reactionary sentiment pressured both governments, the sentiment building into a powerful shearing force that would see both civilizations thrown into the first interstellar war in human history. Concursus delenda est. CDE, Concursus delenda est, or Union must be destroyed. In the space of a few short centuries, peaceful diplomatic cooperation between Union and the new Federation on Caracas had deteriorated to the point of open warfare. Reactionary elements had gripped both governments, resulting in the Second Committee running Union and a coalition of new Anorum firebrands retaining majority control of the new Federation. The long reign of the First Committee in Union ended following what the anthro-chauvinist movement on Cradle saw as repeated acts of complacency in managing other stellar states, refusing to rein in the On and the new Federation chief among them. On Caracas, the new Anorum movement demanded the new Federation push harder to move the polarity of galactic power from Cradle to Caracas, furious that their representatives had become so passive and accommodating to Union's demands. These boiling waters spilled over with a bomb attack on the UNS Pilgrim, a diplomatic yacht sent with a small party of Union officials to tour Caracas. Destroyed by militant hagiographers while docked above Arudai, the Pilgrim became a rallying cry on Cradle for those who wanted Union to be more aggressive central power. For the Second Committee, the Pilgrim's destruction was the first crisis their new government had the power to address, to which they responded by announcing a proportional strike. They would raise a fleet, send it into Karrakin space, and cripple their shipyards. On Caracas, the Pilgrim's destruction was a blow that showed Union could be hurt. Previously, Union nearlighters appeared to be largely untouchable, being built from patterns far more advanced than the ones local to Caracas. The hagiographers, having made Union bleed, were lauded as heroes who did what they needed to preserve Karrakin glory. Hawkish elements of the new Federation voted en masse to raise levies and bolster their fleet. Union had announced the incoming strike, and the Karrakin people did not want to back down. Months pass. Union's fleet burns for Caracas. The new Federation sends its own picket flotillas out in a broad defense bubble around the world. Hagiographs continue to agitate across Caracas, Arudai, and nearby Isfasalar, whipping the populations into a fervor. Using tactics developed first during the last argument, the Karrakins engaged an approaching Union fleet around 10 terameter range, trading missiles and middle confidence predictive kinetics as the encroaching fleet broke through the termination shock of Caracas' home system. Both fleets held their main batteries in reserve. Under full power, the Union fleet was still a month real-time away from Caracas. The ships grew closer. Great missiles, tens of meters long, were intercepted by Karrakin and Union subline ships and flyers, detonating days away from their targets, and interdiction sorties corralled the incoming projectiles. Small engagement flares, the interdiction sorties met one another. Subline ships engaging with only days' distance between them, their enemies represented on waypoints of their HUDs. The great capital ships fired more salvos, the unpredictability gap closing. In the dead night of space, black gigaton kinetics hurtled, silent and cold, through frictionless void. This far out, they were easy enough for ships to sight and adjust around, but counter that ease was the difficulty of choice. Union, the new Fed fleet masters realized, hadn't targeted their fleet with kinetics. They had targeted Caracas and Arudai. The new Fed fleet masters had a choice to make. They could order their ships to continue to engage the Union fleet, ignoring the kinetics in the hopes that Union gunners had miscalculated orbits and potentially stop the fleet well outside the visual range of Caracas, or they could divert, change their course, and attempt to intercept the kinetics in order to prevent them from impacting Caracas or Arudai. At the range Union was engaged with the new Fed fleet and Caracas beyond, the fleet masters had a moderate to high confidence that at least one of the projectiles would find a target, an unacceptable outcome. In the end, as their window of opportunity closed, the new Fed fleet masters decided to break course and intercept the projectiles. Union ships closed the gap and engaged the fleet, opening up on them with high confidence kinetics, missiles, and energy weapons. On paper, the new Fed fleet, larger, more organized, better equipped with better rested crews, fighting on their home turf, should have won. However, the Union Admiral's diversionary attack split the new Feds into small, beleaguered groups of isolated ships, each chasing a different gigaton kinetic. With some capital ships scuttled after diving into the path of the kinetics, subline ships stranded between capital groups and their comms jammed by Union tech, the new Feds could not get organized in time to mount the defense they were capable of. Union's fleet was able to attack the new Feds in small groups, overwhelming the parts before they could form a greater sum. But the loss, through destruction or capture, of the new Fed fleet was not completely in vain. Most all the gigaton kinetics launched by the Union fleet were intercepted, preventing a massacre on a scale as yet unknown. One kinetic slipped through and hit Caracas, illustrating what could have happened if the full flight had not been intercepted. The projectile slammed into the world a few miles off the coast of Delamar, a city with a population of roughly 20 million souls at the time. The ensuing earthquakes and tidal waves devastated the city, killing hundreds of thousands of people and throwing up turbulent storms as fallout triggered by the traumatic impact. Weeks later, Union ships arrived in system, engaging the remaining pickets, mostly subline corvettes, mothballed old capital ships, converted yachts and shuttles, and eliminating them. Caracas, surrounded with its fleet beaten back and a raw wound open on the surface of their world, surrendered. Union, with the heart of Caracas open before them, stopped short of a full-scale invasion of the throne. The world below them howls with air raid sirens and the clamor of people fleeing to their municipal shelters. The bellies of Union ships scrape the sky, flaring bright off Caracas' atmosphere. But the invasion never happens. Throne, its anti-orbital defenses either destroyed or dry of ammunition, does not fall. With little fanfare, the Union fleet pulls back. Karrakin observatories report torch signals angling for Cradle. Something else has happened. Something that needs their desperate, immediate attention. On Caracas, Union's retreat doesn't feel like victory. Delamar smolders from Union's kinetic strike. The wounded litter the streets, damage control and fire suppression teams scramble across the city, pulling the dead from the rubble. Sirens quiet and echo across the flattened city. The pictures of Delamar raised by Union prompts widespread anger from the Hagiographs, who redouble their agitation efforts as their ranks swell. The houses, angered by the seeming ineffective resistance of the new federal government, gather together and vote no confidence. As Union ships depart, the new federal government steps down and is replaced by a new government, operating largely along the same organizational principles as the short-lived new Feds. Composed of the heads of each house, and as a nod to their homeworld, a movement to re-emphasize the unity they ultimately shared, the new government, to cheers and fanfare, declared itself the Federated Baronic States of Caracas and her colonies, or less formally, the Karrakin Baronies. The Baronies' first act is to organize a rebuilding of Throne Caracas and the establishment of the Baronic fleet, beating the recruitment drum with their own chants, speeches, texts, and other media urging the peasantry, minor nobility, and surviving veterans to enlist. Concursus delenda est, the first order uttered in the termination shock battle, is the rallying cry, Union must be destroyed. Unknown to the Karrakin barons is the reason for Union's sudden retreat. The Demos event, triggered circa 3000 U, interrupted the Second Committee's push to dominate Caracas. The committee, unsure of what enemy it faced in its local system, issued a desperate call for all fleets to return in defense of Cradle. Without Ra's unknowing intervention, the invasion of Throne would have occurred. Union, of course, survives the Deimos event, though the phenomena of 3000 to 3002 U forever altered its chartered course. The first contact accords are signed, as much as Monist 1, Ra, can assent to human law, and Monist 1, Ra, disappears through the blank. The second committee, reeling, seeks a way to assert itself, and finds one where it left it, Caracas, resistant. The second Union Baronic War never happens. Utilizing the first NHPs to pilot heavily autonomous ships, Union outpaces the Barons' fleetcraft capability. The Barons, their own machine minds stunted and malfunctioning in the wake of Monist 1's paracausal burst, proved to be a paper tiger. Their first capital ships are simply skeletal bulkheads lashed to orbital shipyards by the time Union fleet arrived in system. Negotiations are swift as both sides realize the possibility of profit. Union agrees to assist in expanding Karrakin infrastructure, in exchange for the Barons agreeing to cease building their fleet. The Second Committee guarantees the Barons will remain heads of their houses and state, so long as they agree to keep Union in supply from their vast material wealth. The Barons find this agreement profitable. They and their descendants will remain in power, Union will foot the bill of rebuilding, in exchange they offered an essential monopoly on their raw material supply. War for the Barons made them appear powerful, but was costly and less profitable than peace and trade. To win without death by capturing markets was the ultimate coup, especially considering that the terms of this peace would enrich and protect Caracas, to them the ultimate prize. Earth, Cradle, as these Unionites called it, was never the goal. So the Barons signed the agreement, a white peace that left both sides alive and enriched. The Barons would not rule the galaxy, but that was never what they wanted. They would leave that trouble to Union, since they seemed to want it so much. The Barons saw that their worlds were their own prize. Union, after all, came to secure them. What more evidence could they want than the self-styled masters of the galaxy attempted to claim their homeworld by force? No, they decided, let Union wear that crown and wrestle with the implications, tragedies, and crimes. The Barons would own the only land that mattered, Caracas, and all her colonies. A crown of nations. The modern baronies have existed in the White Peace that concluded the Second Union Baronic Wars in the early 3000s U. Their official foundation date is pegged to 3200 U, the coronation of the first Prime Baron after a brief period of rule by a series of stewards appointed by the Baronic Council. Since then, the baronies have expanded into their protected concern space, a territory granted to them by right under the Second Committee, and work to develop their held lands into technological and industrial powerhouses. Each major house followed a charted path to dominate a single industry. Once confined to their worlds and the families that composed them, the houses, order, remembrance, glass, sand, smoke, stone, water, moments, and dust, have spread across multiple worlds to advance their granted industry. Each house is best understood now not as a single family, but as a nation under a shared crown. The houses are composed of billions of souls arranged in intricate structures of nobility and broad bases of peasantry. Some are more liberal than others, moment, water, and order, while more conservative houses are gripped by new hagiograph conservative dogma, these being the houses of remembrance, glass, sand, smoke, stone, and dust. The houses send representatives to Caracas to participate in the grand administration of the baronies. The world's population is the most diverse in the Baronic concern, a place of largely progressive, small-c cosmopolitan thought, art, and culture all roiling under the weight of history and monarchical conservation. The Prime Baron makes their home on Caracas, enthroned Caracas, now a sprawling palatial city complex removed from the cultural centers of Old Delamar and Praseres, common destinations for cosmopolitan tourists, merchant, and interconcern travelers. To be a subject of the Barons, whichever house you may be born or made facsimile into, is to be a part of the greatest unbroken chain of human life since the pre-Anthropocene. In school, if you are of the peasant classes, or by tutor or academy if you are of the nobility, you learn that Caracas, not Cradle, is the cultural and historical center of the galaxy. While humanity may have come from Cradle, Earth, as Baronic subjects still call it was saved by Caracas, nurtured by the world, and sent back into space once more. Cradle's time has passed, no matter what they might say about themselves or the land they named themselves hegemon over. It is Caracas that will lead humanity into the future. Patience in the baronies is one of the high virtues. The baronies, being a federation of houses, is not a monolithic culture. Despite how they may seem to outside observers, this perception is exacerbated by their general insular nature, lack of concern with galactic politics, and deference to old systems of monarchy. There are progressive movements in the baronies that agitate for an abolition of the system of monarchy and a movement towards an ignoble parliamentary system. Broadly, the dynastic Cladians, other movements urge for a restoration of the Anorum system, the hagiographs. Various other movements grip each house, some demanding more rights for ignoble baronic subjects, others advocating for an abolition of the facsimile system, and so on. Baronic council sessions are attended by hundreds of lobbyists who pack the galleries above the council floor in Throne Caracas, clamoring to introduce their bills, missives, writs, and demands to be debated and hopefully enshrined into Baronic law. In the baronies, social class is firmly enshrined in a massive system of nobility and ignobility. All who are not barons are considered to be subjects of the prime baron. Broadly speaking, persons of noble class have some claim over land or resource, with a recorded history of ancestry in the baronies separate from the various governments and monarchies that have ruled the interplanetary nation. Nobility, from its earliest inception before the Rise of Pasa-Galia, has always been separated from the government that seeks to rule. Government, until the new federation, was always viewed as the province of those with the power and the will to rule. Those willing to go through the trouble of it, who could rule, were usually accepted as the correct ruler. In the pre-Anorum system and the Anorum system, rule was often patriarchal and cruel, unfair by modern standards. After the dynastic laid and the brief new federation, rule has been granted by baronic consent and blessing of the surviving royal line. Depending on the politics of the subject whom you inquire, this could be a less cruel method, or one that is exploitive and cruel in a different way. In any case, baronic nobility is a cultural structure set aside from the government, but one that is inextricably bound to the council system. In order to participate in high levels of government, high levels being anything larger than a block coordinator, neighborhood leader, or factory foreman, one must be of the noble class. This class designation can only ever be granted by one of rank above the petitioner, is hereditary, and rarely given. Ignoble subjects can rise high in some ranks of social standing, through wealth, celebrity, civic service, the sciences, athletics, and so on. But their official class might prejudice more conservative subjects against them. In short, unless you are of noble blood or granted title, there are limits to how far you can rise in the baronies. This system, a mix of conservative monarchy and cultural thought, plus a many thousand-year cultural history, is widely regarded as oppressive to many subjects both noble and ignoble. Typically young, typically wealthy, typically bored with court life, the noble malcontent often seek a life outside the baronic concern. It is a common enough thing that the nobility has structures in place to account for second choice syndrome. As such, a whole industry has sprung up across the baronies. Structured adventures in wild territories, contracts with terraforming or colonial ventures, work exchange programs with Cradle, the Armory, and other nations, enlistment with a house company, and so on, are all offered to these restless noble youths. Restless, ignoble youths, on the other hand, are rarely offered such catered experiences. Dissatisfaction among the ignoble ranks is generally regarded with suspicion, with republican or communal thought, with ungrateful tendencies, and so on. To those with resource, cultural friction is a wonderful experience to learn and enrich oneself with. To those without, it is viewed as antisocial by the noble classes, one that must be disciplined out. Ignoble youths have few avenues out of their situation: a humble merchant life, a job in a factory or farm, or an enlistment in one of the house companies. As with other stellar nations, the comfortable do not question the status quo. They seek to ensconce themselves in it, to support it, and in turn be supported by it. The ignoble classes, by and large, are afforded just enough power to feel represented. Most baronic subjects encountered outside of the baronies are those of station, funded by their families, either engaged in trade or diplomatic, scientific, or mercenary work. Those of ignoble classes tend to be operating in support of their noble charge, or otherwise engaged in work. Rare is the ignoble subject who managed to flee the baronies and now lives as a free person or citizen of a different state. It is, in fact, more common to encounter those of noble class that have rejected the baronies, as they have the power and resources to be able to lead in the first place. Born to glory. Backgrounds: noble. Major house. Example skills: pull rank, lead, inspire, read a situation, get a hold of something. You are the child of a major house. Your life will be ruled for you, and yours is the charge of empire. Your brothers and sisters likely span a range from ancient to neophyte, and among them haunt plotters in equal numbers to those who pretend to be your allies. You may be a favorite of your parents, a black sheep, or worse, unknown to them, not even unloved. Whatever your mission outside the concern, there burns in your heart a terrible knowledge. Your journey ends on Caracas, under the crown, if you can claim it. You gain the following baronic gear: noble title, noble holding, rival, noble privilege, weight of ages, house chassis, loyal lieutenant. Minor house. Example skills: pull rank, read a situation, get a hold of something, survive. You are the child of a minor house. Yours is one of navigation, of careful application of knowledge and praise, flattery and cruelty. You must know who is who in every situation you encounter. Life, after all, is a ladder to be climbed. No matter how secure you feel, there is always someone above trying to pull the ladder away, and someone below trying to tear you down. Your job, no matter where you go, is to better your family, sometimes even at the expense of your own siblings and cousins, before someone else betters theirs. After all, glory only comes to those who fight for it. You gain the following Baronic gear: Noble Title, Noble Holding, Rival, Noble Privilege, House Chassis, Loyal Lieutenant. Old Karrakin. Example skills: Survive, Charm, Read a Situation, Lead, Inspire. You were Old Karrakin, a child of the old blood from refined ages of antiquity. Maybe your line traces itself back to Tyrannis or Pasa-Galia Zenorum, maybe even earlier, but that doesn't matter much now. Your line, your holdings, all of the glory your ancestors won, has been ground down by the passage of time and the cruel whim of fate. Your family haunts old preserves on Caracas, all but caretakers of the heartland of this vast once empire. The new barons, upstarts, rule in your family's stead. You're comfortable enough, an allowance, a title, days where you and your family don the regalia of old stations and wave to the people, but the power is no longer yours. Though the shame burns, you wait, patient. The wheel of Dis turns over all things. You gain the following Baronic gear: Ancestral Claim, Weight of Ages, Noble Title, House Chassis, Loyal Lieutenant. Fallen House. Example skills: Survive, Read a Situation, Stay Cool, Word on the Street. You are the scion of a fallen house. Perhaps the last of a line, or one of a large noble family laid low by political enemies, the whims of the market, or the vagaries of fate. Perhaps your situation is desperate, or perhaps your humble station is stable. Either way, you have claim to a title and land, but something, debt, or a pretender, an enemy, prevents you from acting upon it. Do you wish to see the glory of your name restored, or are you done with the court? You gain the following Baronic gear: Ancestral Claim, Rival, Weight of Ages, Ancestral Weapon, Lost. Backgrounds: Ignoble. Baronic Merchant. Example skills: Charm, Read a Situation, Word on the Street, Get a hold of something. You hail from an ignoble merchant family in the Baronies. Is it one of the wealthier ones, or are you down on your luck? Or somewhere in between? Do you have a rival noble or ignoble family? Do you do business outside the concern? Or do you only trade with Baronic subjects? What goods do you trade? What is the quality of the product, and how is business? You gain the following Baronic gear: Rival, Loyal Lieutenant. The Masses. Example skills: Choose any four so long as they fit your character, in consult with the GM. You are of the ignoble masses, one subject of billions that live by the pleasure of the Prime Baron and their council. Yours is not a wealthy life, or a notable one, yet. But because that, you have the freedom of anonymity. Maybe you work in one of the factories, or you clean floors in a house palace, or you work a layover shift in the helium mine, or live among the yacht yards repairing noble ships. Your life may not be comfortable, but there is some joy in it, and you have one of the greatest gifts in all of the baronies. You know exactly who your enemies are. How did you become a pilot? You do not have access to Baronic gear, nor any burdens it may carry. You may join the ungratefuls with new hagiographs, generally without question, and without privilege. Facsimile. Example skills: Apply fists to faces, fix, stay cool. You are one of the facsimile, in rough language, a clone. Usually of some volunteer from the soldierly classes or low nobility. You have little you can claim as your own, and your life generally conforms to one or two extremes. Either you are a facsimile of a high-ranking noble, born into service as a potential heir, or you are part of a mass-created batch traded as part of a labor force by powerful families who do not care what happened to you so long as their product orders are filled. Did you work the factories, fields, or mines alongside others who shared your face, or variations of it? Did you lounge among the fine gardens and libraries, chasing your mirrors and avoiding tutors? You do not have access to any Baronic gear, though if you are a facsimile of a noble, you may attempt to act as that noble. If you are found out, there will likely be dramatic capital consequences. If you are the facsimile of a noble that has a rival, you too gain that rival, whether you want to or not. Otherwise, you may join the ungratefuls without question. Most ungratefuls, after all, were facsimiles on Ludra's world. Gear. Baronic. House Chassis. Your chassis is one maintained and passed down through the centuries by pilots in your house. Rebuilt by hand countless times, it carries the weight of ancestors, heroes and cowards both, in its superstructure. Can you hear your ancestors behind the idle neutral base hum of its power plant? That scar there, a reminder from when some elder of elders caught Providence's ill will, that half laurel inscribed behind the pilot couch, a blessing from some long-dead fleet master? How many worlds has this chassis walked? How many has it killed? And you, will your name be scratched into the bones of this machine, or forgotten? May only be selected by Baronic pilots of noble birth. Your chassis is a storied maker, recognizable by others familiar with your family. If you have a rival and you meet in battle, they will show no mercy. As a bonus, you are known as the pilot of this chassis, and may gain an advantage to any leadership roles you make during combat. Noble title: Baron, Underbaron, Viceroy, Pasha, Lord, and on and on. By virtue of birth, you carry a noble title and stand to inherit an even greater one. Do not let this title be your last. You have a noble title and are afforded deference based on that title. Those beneath you in social rank defer to you, and you must defer to those above your station. For those on par with you, seniority, wealth, social favor, and so on determines who gives way to whom. Rivals accepted, of course. Noble privilege. Is it a privilege to rule? A pleasure? Sometimes, yes. Here, though, is the true privilege, to never think that you must ask. This makes some cruel. The rest wrestle with this cruelty and suppose that makes them good. Better to rule than be ruled. You are a significant noble rank, or your family is of great importance. You have a title and holdings, or a first claimant to those holdings. Either way, all of equal or lesser rank show deference to your command, pleasure, and whim, rivals accepted, of course. Be aware, however, yours is a high perch to tumble from, and must be guarded. Noble holding. What lands may I claim? What stars? Those I smile upon, those that I want. Your family currently has prosperous noble holdings, an estate and land on a Baronic world, or a claim in a Baronic interest, or both. Perhaps your family owns mines, terrestrial or orbital, or vast shipyards, factories, or broad agricultural swaths. You may stand to inherit these holdings or lose them should your rival seek to rob you of them. Protect them and do not ignore them. Rival. Et who? You and your family has a rival, usually from a competing family, company, or entity. Though it is not unheard of for rivals to come from the same family. You may know them well or only have heard of them in missives. Either way, their interests directly conflict with yours, and as part of their efforts to ensure their own success, or that of their family, they work to confound your efforts and one-up you. This relationship, if it deteriorates, could come to end in a duel, a battle, a hostile takeover, or an assassination. Name them, know them, win. Weight of ages. The Baronies are great and grand, and Union as well, but the story of humanity is longer than the petty arguments of nobles, the squabbling governments made of men. There is a great portent in this age, a Damoclean sword and a Promethean promise, both that hang above all things. Why can none of them see? Why do they draw blood over feeble things, borders and treaties, coin and data, when there was a larger prize to be won? Your family, or a wizened tutor, or an ancient text, or the mutterings of an NHP on the verge of cascade, has made it known to you that there is a greater project than that of Union or the Baronies. Yours is a life colored by this fact, perhaps dedicated, perhaps dismissive, but you have a feeling. You have a feeling. Name a world, a land, a person, or objective known to your character, and with the GM's permission, that world, land, person, or objective becomes the object of a quest your character embarks on, personal or overt, literal or figurative. Once permission, when a situation demands your role to stay cool, you may choose to automatically pass that check. Ancestral weapon. A broken shaft to spear, repaired and hung above the old hearth. A shattered blade, reformed, whose edge glitters starlight. A finely crafted autocannon, bronzed now, on display in the gardens. Tui, Starbreaker, Sunder Cannon, the level blade. Weapons of myth, some lost, some at the head of armies. What new stories will they write? Your family has claim to an ancestral weapon. This weapon is considered a pilot weapon, either melee or ranged. It is named and can be recognized by Baronic subjects. Its history is valued by other noble families, and it can be traded, gambled, or treated as something with significant value. If used or carried on a person, it can be used to inspire or strike fear. If taken as a trophy, its absence is felt, and the family it has been stolen from bears the shame and loses social standing. If you have an ancestral weapon and wield it in combat, you add to its legend. If you have an ancestral weapon that is lost, its recovery would go a long way to restoring your family's glory. Ancestral claim. What once was here was mine. I shall see it rebuilt. Your family has ancestral claim over a world, a region, or an area of space, but has been lost to a rival. Reclaiming it could mean martial combat, legal intrigue, interhouse politicking, diplomatic overtures, or a combination. However it must be done. Retrieving that claim would significantly increase your family's standing. But be aware, the ends don't always justify the means in the eyes of the other houses. Loyal Lieutenant. Happy to be of service, sir. You have a loyal friend of equal or lesser social rank, typically a distant cousin who is affiliated with a different house. You might have grown up together, served together, once been rivals and are now friends, and so on. However you came to be friends, you are now lifelong companions, romantic or platonic, and share collaborative goals. Your loyal lieutenant may not always be at your side, but rest assured they will work with your best interests in mind as they seek to better their own station. If you have a way of contacting them, you can ask them for some favors, managing estates back in the Baronies, following up on a lead, checking in on someone, etc., but don't overdo it, and expect them to call on you in their time of need. in Part 2 of the Field Guide to the Karrakin Trade Baronies. In Ironclad, how the Baronies encountered and came to adopt the mechanized chassis, details on the particulars of Baronic pilots and the chassis produced by the House of Order, the Tagetes, the Calendula, the Orcus, and the Racii, details on their use in the Baronies, policing, military and cultural, and the great companies and how to attain one of these valued machines, the Royal Academy. The Baronic Academies, how they came to be, how they are regarded, and how one matriculates. Ludra's Malignant Heart, the first appearance of the Ungratefuls on Ludra's world, their history, the state of the Ungratefuls and the Baronies today. The Great Companies, details on the itinerant Baronic mercenary companies, famous historical companies, active companies, and a guide for making your own or generating canon-compliant companies. A Throne over the New World, details on the current Prime Baron, the next expected, and the makeup of the Baronic Council. Details on particular functions of the major houses. And more! If you listen to this entire thing, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me read these things out loud. I know there's a lot of people out there who want to learn lore for games that they like, but they don't always have the time to read however many pages. But they might have, an hour-long commute on the way to work or to somewhere, and they can take some time to just listen to it. If you're interested in more Lancer lore, I do plan on doing more of these. It might take a little bit of time because I don't always have the most quiet recording environment with cars going by or yard work being done outside. If you have lore questions, you can always go on the PilotNet Lancer Discord, which has a great lore section full of people who are really into it and very knowledgeable. I can put a link in the description. You can find me on there, and I always respond to mentions. And I want to extend a very special thanks to Wickenbogger the Wizard on YouTube for actually serving as an inspiration to me recording this. I bought a better mic, and it cut down on the amount of editing that I had to do significantly, which made it easier to make these. So it goes to show if you like something that somebody has done or is making, tell them, encourage them to do more, and they very likely might. So again, thank you. I actually enjoyed this, even if it took a month to make. The next one should take considerably less time now that I'm a lot more familiar with Audacity and the entire process. I also want to say thank you to Miguel and Tom for actually making Lancer. The setting is fantastic, and the more I read through it, the more it just makes me want to make things, be it 3D modeling or projects like this. So again, I really appreciate it, and congratulations on the success of the Kickstarter. So again, thank you for listening if you've listened this far as well. Have a good day.